What's going on, everybody? I hope you've had a great holiday season and an excellent start to the new year. So, late last year, I decided to upgrade my 2019 MacBook Air with Intel's i5 dual core processor to the 2020 MacBook Air with Apple's M1 chip. So, in this video, we'll be comparing the two. We'll talk about the subtle physical differences, the benchmarks, and why you should upgrade if you're also in a similar position that I was in with an Intel MacBook Air. Let's get started. The first physical difference is actually not so subtle. The 2019 version of the MacBook Air comes with the butterfly keyboard, as opposed to the 2020 MacBook Air comes with a keyboard with a scissor switch mechanism instead of the butterfly mechanism. Apple finally made this switch after so many people were complaining about the durability and the lack of travel distance with the butterfly keyboard. I'm happy to say I noticed a pretty big difference between the two. The new keyboard delivers a better typing experience in my opinion, but one thing that I'm not a fan of is Apple replacing the F4, F5, and F6 keys coming from Launchpad, keyboard brightness controls to Spotlight, Dictation, and Do Not Disturb. Those are keys I don't plan on using at all compared to the keyboard brightness was really handy to have on the keyboard as opposed to going into the control center and dragging a slider to manually adjust the brightness. Moving on, we're comparing the specifications side by side. We have the 2020 Intel MacBook Air. They didn't give me an option for the 2019 Intel MacBook Air, but it should be close enough. So right off the bat, with the increased number of cores with the M1 chip, that's going to equate to increased performance and also increased battery life, which is huge for a laptop. One thing that surprised me whenever I was researching the RAM for these MacBook Airs is that 8 gigabytes of memory should be plenty for most people. macOS does a really good job of swapping data between the memory and the SSD. Now, if the SSD is full, then macOS can't offload data from the memory onto the SSD, so it's going to slow down performance. So moving on to battery life, the M1 MacBook Air has an additional 6 hours of battery life, which is pretty significant. Another subtle physical difference between the two MacBooks is the color gamut. On the 2019 version, it had sRGB, and now with the 2020 M1 MacBook Air, it has a P3 color gamut, which is a wider color gamut specifically made from Apple. Both laptops have a 720p webcam, which is pretty underwhelming, but it should be good enough for video chatting. The M1 model does have additional image signal processing, which gives the latest model a slight edge over its predecessor. I really hope in the next refresh we'll see a 1080p webcam, probably with a notch, but I'll take what I can get. Next, the M1 model has a Wi-Fi 6 wireless chip, which is convenient. Benchmarks, and more benchmarks. Today we have benchmarks for everybody. We'll kick it off with the obligatory Cinebench and GeekBench tests. Then we'll move on to the browser speedometer test, which measures the responsiveness of the web browser. We'll do a video export in DaVinci Resolve. And then next we'll do an XcodeBenchmark, and we'll build a couple Docker projects as well. Let's dive into it. Both Cinebench and GeekBench are great tests to compare the single and multi-core performances. The M1 chip is dominating in these tests, and we'll continue to see that throughout. Video editing and exporting on the Intel i5 was hardly tolerable. The experience of editing a video with multiple effects and video overlays was atrocious on the Intel i5. Running the browser benchmark Speedometer 2.0, the Apple M1 chip tripled the performance of the i5 processor. This is especially important nowadays because more and more modern websites are expecting the browser to run heavier JavaScript frameworks. The XcodeBenchmark test is a great way to compare compilation times between processors. According to the README on GitHub, this project is huge, and most projects are of a smaller size. It has 42 CocoaPod libraries and over 70 dependencies in total. For the Docker benchmarks, I tried to even out the playing field by allocating resources fairly. For the i5 configuration, I allocated a total of 4 cores to take full advantage of the 2 cores on the chip. On the M1, I downgraded it from 8 to 2, and I allocated both 8 gigabytes of memory. Even after fairly configuring the resources on both machines, the Apple M1 chip is still outperforming the i5. If you're in a similar position that I was in, where you're hanging on to your Intel MacBook Air, I would highly suggest trading it in for the new M1 MacBook Air. At the end of 2021, I got $450 for the trade-in value from Apple for the Intel MacBook Air, which is pretty astounding to me considering the performance difference between the two machines. This essentially cut the price in half of the new M1 MacBook Air, and on top of that, because it was the holiday season, they had a $100 gift card promotion going on if you bought a new MacBook. So I got $450 off for a good, clean trade-in, and on top of that, I got a $100 gift card to Apple. Also, the trade-in process is pretty easy. You can do it in store, or you can opt for Apple to send you a box to ship your MacBook in. It was pretty straightforward to use Apple's migration assistant, so it was pretty easy to transfer all the files from my old MacBook Air to my new MacBook Air. Overall, I think this is the best value for an Ultrabook that you can get out there, period. But because of the trade-in value and the $100 gift card, it was an excellent deal for me. Thanks for sticking around, y'all. I'll see you in the next video.